Book 6, Chapter 5 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 5, Thursday Afternoon. 1. She was walking with Edwin Clarehanger up Duck Bank on the way to Bursley railway station. A simple errand and promenade, and yet she felt herself to be steeped in the romance of an adventure. The adventure had surprisingly followed upon the discovery that Alicia had been quite wrong. Clayhangers are bound to have a Bradshaw, the confident Alicia had said. But Clayhangers happened not to have a Bradshaw. Edwin was alone in the stationery shop, save for the assistant. He said that his father was indisposed, and whereas the news that Clayhangers had no Bradshaw left Hilda perfectly indifferent, the news that old Darius Clayhanger was indisposed and absent produced in her a definite feeling of gladness. Edwin had decided that the most likely place to search for a Bradshaw was the station, and he had offered to escort her to the station. Nothing could have been more natural, and at the same time more miraculous. The sun was palely shining upon dry, clean pavements, and upon roads juicy with black mud. And in the sunshine Hilda was very happy. It was nothing to her that she was in quest of a Bradshaw, because she had just received an ominous telegram urgently summoning her to Brighton. She was obliviously happy. Every phenomenon that attracted her notice contributed to her felicity. Thus she took an eager joy in the sun, and a marked improvement in Edwin's cold really delighted her. She was dominated by the intimate conviction, "He loves me," which conviction excited her dormant pride and made her straighten her shoulders. She benevolently condescended towards Janet. After all, Janet, with every circumstance in her favour, had not known how to conquer Edwin Clayhanger. After all, she, Hilda, possessed some mysterious characteristic more potent than the elegance and the goodness of Janet Orgreave. She scorned her former self-deprecations, and reproached her own lack of faith. I am I. That was the summary of her mood. As for her attitude to Edwin Clayhanger, she could not explain it. Why did she like him, and like being with him? He was not brilliant, nor masterful, nor handsome, nor well-dressed, nor in any manner imposing. On the contrary, he was awkward and apologetic, and not a bit spectacular. Only the wistful gaze of his eyes, and his honest smile, and the appeal of his gestures. A puzzling affair, an affair perfectly incomprehensible and enchanting. They walked side by side in silence. When they had turned into Moorthorne Road, halfway up whose slope lies the station, she asked a question about a large wooden building from whose interior came wild sounds of shouting and cheering, and learnt that the Potters on strike were holding a meeting in the town theatre. At the open outer doors was a crowd of starving, shivering, dirty, ragged children, who romped and cursed or stood unnaturally meditative in the rich mud, like fakirs fulfilling a vow. Hilda's throat was constricted by the sight. Pain and joy ran together in her, burning exquisitely, and she had a glimpse, obscure, of the mystical beauty of the children's suffering. "I'd no idea there was a theatre in Bursley," she remarked idly, driven into a banality by the press of her sensations. "They used to call it the Blood Tub," he replied. "Melodrama and murder and gore, you know." She exclaimed in horror. "Why are people like that in the Five Towns?" "It's our form of poetry, I suppose," said he. She started sensitively. It seemed to her that she had never understood the secret inner spirit of the Five Towns, and that by a single phrase he had made her understand it. Our form of poetry. Who but he could have said a thing at once so illuminating and so simple? Apparently perplexed by the obvious effect on her of his remark, he said, "But you belong to the Five Towns, don't you?" She answered quietly that she did, but her heart was saying, "I do now. You have initiated me. I never felt the Five Towns before. You have made me feel them." 2. At the station the head porter received their inquiry for a Bradshaw with a dull stare and a shake of the head. No such thing had ever been asked for at Bursley station before, and the man's imagination could not go beyond the soiled timetables loosely pinned and pasted up on the walls of the booking-office. Hilda suggested that the ticket clerk should be interrogated, but the aperture of communication with him was shut. She saw Edwin Clayhanger brace himself and rap on the wood, and instead of deploring his diffidence, she liked it and found it full of charm. The partition clicked aside, and the ticket clerk's peering, suspicious head showed in its place, mutely demanding a reason for this extraordinary disturbance of the dream in which the station slumbered between two half-hourly trains. With a characteristic, peculiar, slanting motion, Edwin nodded. "Oh, how do you do, Mr. Brooks?" said Edwin hastily, as if startled by the sudden, inexplicable apparition of the head. But the ticket clerk had no Bradshaw either. He considered it probable, however, that the station-master would have a Bradshaw. Edwin had to brace himself again for an assault upon the fastness of the station-master. And in the incredibly small and incredibly dirty fastness of the station-master they indeed found a Bradshaw. Hilda precipitately took it and opened it on the station-master's table. She looked for Brighton in it as she might have looked for a particular individual in a city. Then Edwin was bending over it with his ear close to her ear, and the sleeve of his overcoat touching her sleeve. She was physically aware of him for the first time. She thought, disconcerted, "But he's an utter stranger to me. What do I know of him?" And then she thought, "For more than a year he must have carried my image in his heart." "Here," said Edwin brusquely and with a certain superiority, "you might just let me have a look at it myself." She yielded, tacitly admitting that a woman was no match for Bradshaw. After a few moments' frowning, Edwin said, "Yes, there's a train to Brighton at 11:30 tonight." "May I look?" "Certainly," said he, subtly condescending. She examined the page with a serious deliberation. "But what does this F mean?" she asked. "Did you notice this F?" "Yes, it means Thursdays and Saturdays only," said Edwin, his eyes twinkling. It was as if he had said, "You think yourself very clever, but do you suppose that I can't read the notes in a timetable?" "Well," she hesitated. "Today's Thursday, you see," he remarked curtly. She was ravished by his tone and his manner, and she became humble before him, for in the space of a few seconds he had grown mysteriously and powerfully masculine to her. But with all his masculinity there remained the same wistful, honest, boyish look in his eyes. And she thought, "If I marry him, it will be for the look in his eyes." "I'm all right, then," she said aloud, and smiled. With hands nervously working within her muff, she suddenly missed the handkerchief which she had placed there. "I believe I must have dropped my handkerchief in your shop," she was about to say. The phrase was actually on her tongue, but by a strange, instinctive, defensive discretion she shut her mouth on it and kept silence. She thought, "Perhaps I had better not go into his shop again to-day." 3. They descended the hill from the station. Hilda was very ill at ease. She kept saying to herself, "This adventure is over now. I cannot prolong it. There is nothing to do but to go back to the Orgreaves and pack my things and depart to Brighton, and face whatever annoyances are waiting me at Brighton." The prospect desolated her. She could not bear to leave Edwin Clayhanger without some definition of their relations, and yet she knew that it was hopeless and absurd to expect to arrive immediately at any such definition. She knew that the impetuosity of her temperament could not be justified. Also, she feared horribly the risk of being caught again in the net of Brighton. As they got lower and lower down the hill, her wretchedness and disquiet became acute, to the point of a wild despair. Merely to temporize, she said, as they drew opposite the wooden theatre, "Couldn't we just go and look in? I've got plenty of time." A strange request, to penetrate into a meeting of artisans on strike. She felt its strangeness. She felt that Edwin Clayhanger objected, but she was driven to an extremity. She had to do something, and she did what she could. They crossed the road and entered the huge shanty, and stood apologetically near the door. The contrast between the open street and the enclosed stuffiness of the dim and crowded interior was overwhelming. Hundreds of ragged and shabby men sat in serried rows, leaning forward with elbows out and heads protruding, as they listened to a speech from the gimcrack stage. They seemed to be waiting to spring, like famished and ferocious tigers. Interrupting, they growled, snarled, yapped, and swore with appalling sincerity. Imprecations burst forth in volleys and in running fires. The arousing of the fundamental instincts of these human beings had, indeed, enormously emphasized the animal in them. They had swung back 100 centuries towards original, crude life. The sophistication which embroiders the will to live had been stripped clean off. These men helped you to understand the state of mind which puts a city to the sack, and makes victims especially of the innocent and the defenceless. Hilda was strangely excited. She was afraid and enjoyed being afraid, and it was as if she too had been returned to savagery and to the primeval. In the midst of peril she was a female under the protection of a male, and nothing but that. And she was far closer emotionally to her male than she had ever been before. Suddenly the meeting came to an end. In an instant the mass of humanity was afoot and rounding upon them an active menace. Hilda and Edwin rushed fleeing into the street, violently urged by a common impulse. The stream of embittered men pursued them like an inundation. When they were safe and breathing the free air, Hilda was drenched with a sense of pity. The tragedy of existence presented itself in its true aspect, as noble and majestic and intimidating. "It's terrible," she breathed. She thought, "No, in this mood it is impossible for me to leave him. I cannot do it. I cannot." The danger of re-entering the shop, which would be closed now, utterly fascinated her. Supposing that she re-entered the shop with him, would she have the courage to tell him that she was in his society under false pretences? Could she bring herself to relate her misfortune? She recoiled before the mere idea of telling him, and yet the danger of the shop glittered in front of her like a lure. The future might be depending solely on her own act. If she told him of the lost handkerchief, the future might be one thing. If she did not tell him, it might be another. The dread of choosing seized her, and put her into a tremble of apprehension. And then, as it were mechanically, she murmured, but very clearly, tacking the words without a pause onto a sentence about the strikes, "Oh, I've lost my handkerchief, and so I've left it in your shop. It must have dropped out of my muff." She sighed in relief because she had chosen, but her agitation was intensified. 4. In search of a lost handkerchief, they regained the Clayhanger premises by an unfamiliar side door. She preceded him along a passage, and then, taking a door on the left, found herself surprisingly in the shop behind a counter. The shop was lighted only by a few diamond-shaped holes in the central shutters, and it had a troubling aspect of portent, with its merchandise mysteriously enveloped in pale sheets, and its chairs wrong side up, and its deep-shadowed corners. Destiny might have been lurking in one of those baffling corners. From above, through the ceiling, came the vibration of some machine at work, and the machine might have been the loom of time. Hilda was exquisitely apprehensive. She thought, "I am here. The moment of my departure will come. When it comes, shall I have told him my misfortune? What will have happened?" She waited, nervous, restless, shaking like a victim who can do naught but wait. "Here's my handkerchief," she cried in a tone of unnatural childish glee. That was one of the effects of her secret panic. The handkerchief glimmered on the counter, more white than anything else in that grey dusk. She guessed that the shop assistant must have found it and placed it conspicuously on the counter. They were alone. They were their own prisoners, secure from the street and from all interruption. Hilda, once more and in a higher degree, realized the miraculous human power to make experience out of nothing. They had nothing but themselves, and they could, if they chose, create all their future by a single gesture. Suddenly there came a tremendous shouting from Duck Square, in front of the shop. The strikers had poured down from Moorthorne Road into Duck Bank and Duck Square. Edwin, who was in the middle of the shop, went to the glazed inner doors, and, passing through into the porch, lifted the letter-flap in a shutter, and, stooping, looked forth. He called to her, without moving his face from the aperture, that a fight was in progress. Hilda gazed at his back, through the glass, and then, coming round the end of the counter, approached quietly and stood immediately behind him, between the glazed doors and the shutters. The two were in a space so small that they could scarcely have moved without touching. Let me look," she stammered, unable any longer to tolerate the inaction. Edwin Clayhanger stepped aside and held up the letter-flap for her with his finger. She bent her head to the oblong glimpse of the street, and saw the strikers engaged in the final internecine folly of strikers. They had turned their exasperated wrath upon each other. Within a public house at the top of the little square, other strikers were drinking. One policeman regarded them. "What a shame!" she cried angrily, dropping the flap, and then withdrew quickly into the shop whither Edwin had gone. And as she came near him, her mood changed. She smiled gently. She summoned all her charm, and she knew that she charmed him. "Do you know," she said, "you've quite altered my notion of poetry, what you said as we were going up to the station." "Really?" He flushed. Yes, she had enchanted and entranced him. She had only to smile and to use a particular tone, soft and breaking. She knew that. "But you do alter my notions," she continued, and her clear voice was poured out like a liquid. "I don't know how it is—" She stopped, and then, in half-playful accents, "So this is your little office?" Her hand was on the knob of the open door of the cubicle, a black erection within the shop, where Edwin and his father kept the accounts and wrote letters. "Yes, go in and have a look at it," she murmured kindly. "Shall I?" and went in. He followed. For a moment she was extremely afraid, and she whispered, scared, "I must hurry off now." He ignored this remark. "Shall you be at Brighton long?" he demanded. And he was so friendly and simple and timorous and honest-eyed, and his features had such an extraordinary anxious expression, that her own fear seemed to leave her. She thought, as if surprised by the discovery, "He is a good friend." "Oh, I can't tell," she answered him. "It depends." "How soon should you be down our way again?" His voice was thickening. She shook her head, speechless. She was afraid again now. His face altered. He was standing almost over her. She thought, "I am lost. I have let it come to this." He was no longer a good friend. He began to speak in detached bits of phrases. "I say, you know—" "Good-bye, good-bye," she murmured anxiously. "I must go. Thanks very much." And foolishly she held out her hand, which he seized. He bent passionately, and kissed her like a fresh boy, like a schoolboy. And she gave back the kiss strongly, with all the profound sincerity of her nature. His agitation appeared to be extreme, but she was calm. She was divinely calm. She savoured the moment as though she had been a watcher and not an actor in the scene. She thought, with a secret sigh of bliss, "Yes, it is real, this moment, and I have had it. Am I astonished that it has come so soon, or did I know it was coming?" Her eyes drank up the face and the hands and the gestures of her lover. She felt tired, and sat down in the office chair, and he leaned on the desk, and the walls of the cubicle folded them in, even from the inanimate scrutiny of the shop. 5. They were talking together, half fearfully, and yet with the confidence of deep mutual trust, in the quick gathering darkness of the cubicle. And while they were talking, Hilda, in her head, was writing a fervent letter to him. "You see, it was so sudden. I'd had no chance to tell you. I did so want to tell you, but how could I? And I hadn't told anybody. I'm sure you'll agree with me that it is best to tell some things as little as possible. And when you had kissed me, how could I tell you then, at once? I could not. It would have spoilt everything. Surely you understand?" "I know you do, because you understand everything. If I was wrong, tell me where. You don't guess how humble I am. When I think of you, I am the humblest girl you can imagine. Forgive me, if there is anything to forgive. I don't need to tell you that I have suffered." And she kept writing the letter again and again, slightly altering the phrases so as to improve them, so as to express herself better and more honestly and more appealingly. "I shall send you the address tomorrow," she was saying to him. "I shall write to you before I go to bed, whether it's tonight or tomorrow morning." She put the fire of her love into the assurance. She smiled to entrance him, and saw on his face that he was beside himself with joy in her. She was a queen, surpassing in her prerogative 1,000 elegant Janets. She smiled, she proudly straightened her shoulders, she the humblest, and her boy was enslaved. "I wonder what people will say," he murmured. She said, with a pang of misgiving about his reception of her letter, "Please tell no one." She pleaded that for the present he should tell no one. "Later on it won't seem so sudden," she added plausibly. "People are so silly." The sound of another battle in Duck Square awoke them. The shop was very chilly and quite dark. Their faces were only pale ovals in the blackness. She shivered. "I must go. I have to pack." He clasped her, and she was innocently content. She was a young girl again. "I'll walk up with you," he said protectively. But she would not allow him to walk up with her, and he yielded. He struck a match. They stumbled out, and in the midnight of the passage he took leave of her. Walking up Trafalgar Road, alone, she was so happy, so amazed, so relieved, so sure of him and of his fineness and of the future, that she could scarcely bear her felicity. It was too intense. At last her life was settled and mapped out. Destiny had been kind, and she meant to be worthy of her fate. She could have swooned, so intoxicant was her wonder and her solemn joy, and her yearning after righteousness in love. End of Book 6, Chapter 5. Book 6, Chapter 6 of Hilda Lessways by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Book 6, Chapter 6. Mischance. 1. 12 days later, in the evening, Hilda stood by the bedside of Sarah Gailey in the basement room of No. 59 Preston Street. There was a bright fire in the grate, and in front of the fire a middle-aged doctor was cleansing the instrument which he had just employed to inject morphia into Sarah's exhausted body. Hilda's assumption that the ageing woman had telegraphed for her on inadequate grounds had proved to be quite wrong. Upon entering the house on that Thursday night, Hilda, despite the anxious, pale face of the new servant who had waited up for her, and who entreated her to see Sarah Gailey instantly, had gone first to her own room and scrawled passionately a note to Edwin, which ran, "Dearest, this is my address. I love you. Every bit of me is absolutely yours. Write me. H. L." She gave the letter to the servant to post at once, and as she gave it She had a vision of it travelling in post-office railway vans, and being sorted and sealed up in a bag, and recovered from the bag, and scanned by the postman at Bursley, and borne up Trafalgar Road by the postman, and dropped into the letter-box at Edwin's house, and finally seized by Edwin, and of it pleasing him intensely, for it was a good letter, and she was proud of it because she knew that it was characteristic. And then, with her mind freed, she had opened the door of Sarah's bedroom. Sarah was unquestionably very ill. Sarah had been quite right in telegraphing so peremptorily to Hilda, and if she had not so telegraphed, she would have been quite wrong. On the previous day she had been sitting on the cold new oilcloth of the topmost stairs, minutely instructing a maid in the craft of polishing banisters, and the next morning an attack of acute sciatica had supervened. For a trifling indiscretion, Sarah was thus condemned to extreme physical torture. Hilda had found her rigid on the bed. She suffered the severest pain in the small of the back, and all down the left leg. Her left knee was supported on pillows, and the bedclothes were raised away from it, for it could tolerate no weight whatever. The doctor, who had been and gone, had arranged a system of fermentation and hot water bottles surpassing anything in even Sarah's experience. And there Sarah lay, not feverish, but sweating with agony, terrified to move, terrified to take a deep breath, lest the disturbance of the muscles might produce consequences beyond her strength to endure. She was in no danger of death. She could talk, she could eat and drink, her pulse was scarcely quickened. But she was degraded and humiliated by mere physical anguish to the condition of a brute. This was her lot in life. All through that first night Hilda stayed with her, trying to pretend that Sarah was a woman, and in the morning she had assumed control of the house. She had her secret to console her. It remained a secret because there was no one to whom she could relate it. Sarah had no ear for news unconnected with her malady, and indeed to tell Sarah, as Sarah was, would have been to carry callousness to the point of insult. And so Hilda, amid her enormous labours and fatigue, had lived with her secret, which, from being a perfumed delight, turned in 2 days to something subtly horrible, to something that by its horror prevented her from writing to Edwin aught but the briefest missives. She had existed from hour to hour, from 1 minute apprehensively to the next, day and night, hardly sleeping, devoured inwardly by a fear at once monstrous and simple, at once convincing and incredible. As for the letter which mentally she had composed 100 times to Edwin, and which she owed to him, it had become fantastic, and then inconceivable to her. 2. One of the new servants entered the room and handed a letter to Hilda, and left the room and shut the door. The envelope was addressed, Miss Lessways, 59 Preston Street, Brighton, in Edwin Clayhanger's beautiful handwriting. Every evening came thus a letter, which he had posted in Bursley on the previous day. Hilda thought, "Will this contain another reproach of my irregularity? I can't bear it if it does." And she gazed at the handwriting, and in particular at her own name, and her own name seemed to be the name of somebody else, of some strange young woman. She felt dizzy. The door of Sarah's wardrobe was ajar, and in the mirror of it Hilda could see herself obscurely, a black-robed, strange young woman, with untidy hair and white cheeks, and huge, dark, staring, heavy eyes, with pouches beneath them. The image wavered in the mirror. She thought, "Here it is again, this awful feeling. Surely I'm not going to faint." She could hear Sarah's sighing breath. She could hear the singing of the shaded gas-flame. She turned her gaze away from the mirror, and saw Sarah's grey head inadvertently nodding, as it always nodded. Then the letter slipped out of her hand. She glanced down at the floor in pursuit of it. The floor was darkly revolving. She thought, "Am I really fainting this time? I mustn't faint. I've got to arrange about that bacon tonight, and lots of things. Sarah is not a bit better, and I must sit with her until she gets off to sleep." Her legs trembled, and she was terrorized by extraordinarily novel sensations of insecurity. "Oh!" she murmured weakly. 3. "You've only fainted," said the doctor in a low voice. She perceived little by little that she was lying flat on the floor at the foot of Sarah's bed, and that he was kneeling beside her. The bed threw a shadow on them both, but she could see his benevolent face, anxious and yet reassuring, rather clearly. "What?" she whispered in feeble despair. She felt that her resistance was definitely broken. From higher up at the level of the hidden bed came the regular plaintive respiration of Sarah gaily. "You must take care of yourself better than this," said the doctor. "Perhaps this is a day when you ought to be resting." She answered, resigned. "No, it's not that. I believe I'm going to have a child. You must—" She stopped. "Oh," said the doctor with discretion. "Is that it?" Strange how the direct words would create a new situation. She had not told the doctor that she had been through the ceremony of marriage and had been victimized. She had told him nothing but the central and final thought in her mind. And lo, the new situation was brought into being, and the doctor was accepting it. He was not omitting astounded buts. Her directness had made all possible buts seem ridiculous and futile, and had made the expression of curiosity seem offensive. She lay on the floor impassive. She was no longer horrified by expectancy. "Well," said the doctor, "we must see. I think you can sit up now, can't you?" 3/4 of an hour afterwards she went into Sarah's room alone. She was aware of no emotion whatever. She merely desired, as a professional nurse might have desired, to see if Sarah slept. Sarah was not sleeping. She moaned, as she moaned continually when awake. Hilda bent over her trembling head, whose right side pressed upon the pillow. "How queer," thought Hilda. "How awful that she didn't even hear what I said to him. It will almost kill her when she does know." Sarah's eyes blinked. Without stirring, without shifting her horizontal, preoccupied gaze from the wall, she muttered peevishly, "What's that you were saying about going to have a child?" Startled, Hilda moved back a little from the bed. "The doctor says there's no doubt I am," Hilda answered coldly. "How queer," Sarah said. "I quite thought— But of course a girl like you couldn't be sure. I should like another biscuit, but I don't want the Osbornes, the others." She resumed her moaning. On the following Saturday morning, rather more than a fortnight after her engagement to Edwin Clayhanger, Hilda came out of the kitchen at No. 59 Preston Street, and shut the door on a nauseating, malodorous mess of broken food and greasy plates, in the midst of which 2 servants were noisily gobbling down their late breakfast and disputing. With a frown of disgust on her face, she looked into Sarah Gailey's bedroom. Sarah, though vaguely better, was still in constant acute pain, and her knee still reposed on a pillow and was protected from the upper bedclothes, and she still could not move. Hilda put on a smile for Sarah Gailey, who nodded morosely, and then, extinguishing the smile as if it had been expensive gas burning to no purpose, she passed into the basement sitting-room and slaked the fire there. With a gesture of irresolution, she lifted the lid of the desk in the corner, and gazed first at a little pile of 4 unopened letters addressed to her in Edwin's handwriting, and then at a volume of Crashaw, which the enthusiastic Tom Orgreave had sent to her as a reward for her appreciation of Crashaw's poems. She released the lid suddenly, and went upstairs to her bedroom, chatting sugarily for an instant on the way with the second Miss Watchett. In the bedroom she donned her street things, and then she descended. She had to go to the registry office in North Street about a new cook. She stopped at the front door, and then surprisingly went down once more into the basement sitting-room. Standing up at the desk, she wrote this letter. "Darling Janet, I am now married to George Cannon. The marriage is not quite public, but I tell you before anybody, and you might tell Edwin Clayhanger. Your loving H. L." least said, soonest mended, and the conciseness would discourage questioning. She inserted the letter into an envelope, which she addressed and stamped, and then she fled with it from the house, and in 2 minutes it was in a letter-box, and she was walking slowly along the King's Road past the shops. The letter was the swift and desperate sequel to several days' absolutely sterile reflection. It said enough for the moment. Later she could explain that her husband had left her. She could not write to Edwin. She could not bring herself to write anything to him. She could not confess, nor beg for forgiveness, nor even for sympathetic understanding. She could not admit the uninstructed rashness which had led her to assume positively, on inadequate grounds, that her union with George Cannon had been fruitless. She must suffer, and he also must suffer. Rather than let him know in any conceivable manner that all unwitting she was bearing the child of another at the moment of her betrothal to himself, she preferred to be regarded as a jilt of the very worst kind. Strange that she should choose the role of deceiver instead of the role of victim. Strange that she would sooner be hated and scorned than pitied. Strange that she would not even give Edwin the opportunity of treating her as a widow. But so it was. For her, the one possible attitude towards Edwin was the attitude of silence. In the silence of the grave, her love for him existed. As she walked along the chill promenade, she looked with discreet curiosity at every woman she met, to see her condition. This matter, which before she had never thought of, now obsessed her, and all women were divided for her into 2 classes, the expectant and the others. Also, her self-consciousness was extreme, more so even than it had been after her mother's death. She was not frightened, yet. She was assuredly not panic-struck. Rather, her mood was grim, harsh, and calmly bitter. She thought, I suppose George must be informed. It affected her queerly that if she took it into her head she need never go back to Preston Street. She was free. She owed nothing to anybody. And yet she would go back. She would require a home soon, and she would require a livelihood, for the shares of the Brighton Hotel Continental Limited promised to be sterile and were already unsaleable. But apart from these considerations, she would have gone back for Sarah Gailey, because Sarah Gailey was entirely dependent on her. She detested Sarah, despite Sarah's sufferings, and yet, by her conscience, she was for ever bound to her. The future loomed appalling. Sarah's career was finished. She could not be anything but a burden and a torment. Her last years would probably be dreadful, both for herself and for others. The prospects of the boarding-house were not radiant. Hilda could direct the enterprise, but not well. She could work, but she had not the art of making others work. Already the place was slightly at 6s and 7s, and she loathed it. She loathed the whole business of catering. Along the entire length of the King's Road the smells of basement kitchens ascended to the pavement and offended the nose. And Hilda saw all Brighton as a colossal and disgusting enlargement of the kitchen at number 59. She saw the background and the pits of Brighton, that which underlies and hides behind and is not seen. The grandeur of the King's Road was naught to her. Her glance pierced it, and it faded to a hallucination. Beyond it she envisaged the years to come, the messy and endless struggle, the necessary avarice and trickeries incidental to it, and perhaps the ultimate failure. She would never make money. She felt that. She was not born to make money, especially by dodges and false politeness, out of idle, empty-noddled borders. She would lose it and lose it. And she pictured what she would be in 10 years, the hard-driven landlady, up to every subterfuge, with a child to feed and educate, and perhaps a bedridden, querulous invalid to support. And there was no alternative to the tableau. She went by the Chichester, which towered with all its stories above her head. Who would take it now? George Cannon would have made it pay. He would have made anything pay. How? She was definitely cut off from the magnificence of the King's Road. The side street was her destiny, the side street and shabbiness, and it was all George's fault, and hers. The poverty, if it came, would be George's fault alone, for he had squandered her money in a speculation. It astounded her that George, so shrewd and well-balanced, should have made an investment so foolish. She did not realize that a passion for a business enterprise, as for a woman, is capable of destroying the balance of any man. And George Cannon had had both passions. And then she saw Florrie Bagster on the other side of the street, walking leisurely by the sea wall, alone. If Mr. Boutwood had had a more generous and wild disposition, he might have allowed Florrie to ruin him in 6 months of furs and carriages and champagne. But Mr. Boutwood, though a dog, was a careful dog, especially at those moments when the conventional dog can refuse nothing. Florrie was well and warmly dressed, no more, and she was on foot. Hilda's gaze fastened on her, and immediately divined from the cut and fall of the coat that Florrie had something to conceal from everyone but her Mr. Boutwood. And whereas Florrie trod the pavement with a charming little air that wavered between impudence and modesty, between timid meekness and conceit, Hilda blushed with shame and pity. She on one footpath, and Florrie on the other. Soon, she thought, I shall not be able to walk along this road. She had sinned. She admitted that she had sinned against some quality in herself. But how innocently and how ignorantly, and what a tremendous punishment for so transient a weakness! And new consequences, still more disastrous than any she had foreseen, presented themselves one after another. George had escaped, but a word of open scandal, a single whisper in the ear of the old creature down at Torquay, might actuate machinery that would reach out after him and drag him back, and plant him in jail. George, the father of her child, in jail? It was all a matter of chance, sheer chance. She began to perceive what life really was, and the immense importance of hazard therein. Nevertheless, without frailty, without defection, what could chance have done? She began to perceive that this that she was living through was life. She bit her lips. Grief, shame, disillusion, hardship, peril, catastrophe, exile. Above all, exile. These had to be faced, and they would be faced. She recalled the fariest verse of Crashaw, and she set her shoulders back. There was the stuff of a woman in her. Only a little while, and she had seen before her a beloved boy entranced by her charm. She had now no charm. Where now was the soft virgin? And yet, somehow, magically, miraculously, the soft virgin was still there, and the invincible vague hope of youth and the irrepressible consciousness of power were almost ready to flame up afresh, contrary to all reasons, and irradiate her starless soul.